Yes, my name indeed is Anko Hohen. I'm senior consultant at CE Delft. Thank you for the opportunity to present our findings from the report. I did not do this myself, of course. Colleagues from CE Delft, Denise Hilster and Julius Kirali are also in the meeting and have helped me considerably putting this all together. I will try and share my screen now so you can see the presentation. 1 second. I hope you can see it now. Thank you very much. Okay, so this is a study about air pollution and transport, as Matteo already said, and looking specifically at policies at the city level. The contents of the presentation today, I will first tell you something about the background of the study. Then after that, I will show some figures mostly about the state of play, current state of play of the transport sector and also other sectors. So how have emission levels developed over time and how are they expected to develop in the future? After that, I will say something about ambient concentrations, which is something different actually than emission levels. And that's important to realize. Then I will go into the second part of the presentation and look at some policy interventions we looked at specifically at 5 selected measures, which we go into some more depth. And then I will finish, of course, with the main conclusions from the study. So something about the background. In 2018, we already carried out a study for the EVA. And that found indeed that currently, or actually in 2016, which was the base year, health-related costs of traffic was quite substantial and amounted to 67 to 80 billion euros yearly in European countries. And this was mainly caused by diesel vehicles. And also of all these costs, of all these social costs, about 90 to 95% were health related. And again, also NOx, so nitrogen oxides, has the largest share in the total costs, health costs that we calculated. We also looked at how this will develop in the future, and we found that social costs will decrease over time. Up to 2030, costs will still be around 20 to 26 billion euros, but they will drop considerably due to policies that are already in place and which is mostly results from European emission standards in vehicles, as you already probably know. But still, exposure to traffic emissions is high in urban areas, of course, and these 20 to 26 billion of costs, they are mainly caused in city areas, and this led to the question from EVA to CE Delft: what transport policy could actually be taken by local or city governments to reduce emissions and also to reduce social costs further? And this was actually the main question we tried to tackle in the study I will now present. So first, looking at the state of play, the emission levels, I will have a quick glance in a number of figures just now about the current total emission levels in 33 countries, mainly European Union. I will focus on NOx and PM. After that, I will show something about the share of transport in all these emissions. Then I will say something about the expected trend for 2030. And then also something about the emissions versus the ambient concentrations, which are not quite the same. And this is important to realize. So the first diagram or figure is this one. It looks at the emissions of NOx and PM of all sectors, where PM is divided between PM 2.5 and PM 10. And you can see clearly that particularly NOx emissions have dropped considerably between 1990 and 2018. The same is actually true for PM 2.5 and PM 10, which is better shown in the right part of the diagram, which is an index figure, which shows that between 1990 and 2018, emission levels have dropped approximately 40 to 60% for NOx and PM. Then if we look at transport, first at particulate matter, PM, we see that also the emissions have dropped of transport PM emissions between 1990 and 2018. And we can also see the share of transport in total emissions. And this has remained fairly constant, actually, between 1990 and 2018, and is about 10 to 15% of all overall emissions in these countries. For nitrogen oxides, the share is considerably larger. about 40 to 50% can be attributed to transport emissions of overall NOx emissions in these 33 countries. We can see that the overall levels have dropped, but the share of transport has not dropped considerably over this same period. So the share is pretty much still the same as it was in 1990. The next figure shows the share of different modes of transport within the emissions of transport, within the transport sector. We can see here that passenger cars, heavy-duty vehicles and buses, and also light-duty vehicles were quite high in the share of emissions of PM in 1990, but this has dropped over the period, mostly due to the introduction of European emission standards for road vehicles. We can also see, which is marked here as other road transport, the green bar. This is actually emissions, PM emissions from tire wear and also brake wear. And we can see that these emissions have actually increased somewhat over the period and are in 2018 actually the dominant share in overall PM emissions of transport. So this is something which is quite important to note. These are not exhaust emissions, but they indeed do also pose a health problem, and they are not tackled by measures to reduce exhaust emissions from vehicles by the Euro emission standard. So they remain fairly constant, or have quite a large share. Then looking at nitrogen oxides, NOx, we see here much more clearly that passenger cars and heavy-duty vehicles have the bulk in the emissions of NOx in road transport. Also, light-duty vehicles have some share, but other modes are not very present in this diagram, do not cause a lot of emissions from road transport in this period. And we see again the overall trend is downwards. But still, there are quite high levels of NOx emissions in 2018. Now, if we look forward into the future, we see in this diagram the share between petrol and diesel vehicles and how they contribute to, first of all, PM 2.5, in this case, emissions. We see that petrol has a very small share relatively, and diesel has a quite high share in 2016 on the left-hand side of this diagram. And also we can see that in metropolitan and urban areas, about 50% of these emissions occur there. So it is quite important to look specifically at urban areas if we want to tackle health issues from emissions from road transport. On the right-hand side, that is the diagram for 2030. And the green area shows how much these emissions are expected to drop between now, or between 2016 and 2030, which is, as I said earlier, considerable. Due to the European emission standards, the expected drop in emissions will be quite substantial. But still, there will be a level of emissions will remain, and it will not go to zero quite yet. Next diagram for nitrogen oxides emissions, same diagram. We also see here that diesel is dominant in the NOx emissions, and also the share of metropolitan and urban is over 50% in 2016. And again, also this share will drop into the future. Expected emissions in 2030 are considerably lower than in 2016. But for NOx, actually, these emissions remain somewhat higher because the effectiveness of the measures in place, the control measures for vehicles, are somewhat less effective than for PM. So work remains is a conclusion that we can conclude from that. Then this is an outcome of the previous study looking at the costs of air pollution in 2030. Just to look back at what we found there, and we see we had two methods in that previous report. It's not very important now to look at what the differences in these measures are, but overall we see that the total costs, health costs in 2016, amount to the 67 to 80 billion euros I mentioned earlier. With even a bandwidth, it could be higher because uncertainties, of course, exist. And we can also see that the health costs, as a share of the total costs, are dominant in this figure. And we see that on the right-hand side, the cost of air pollution will drop because of policies in place already, but will not go to zero quite yet. And as we see that exposure in cities is quite high, emission levels in cities are about 50% of all emissions, there's certainly a rationale for looking at implementation of measures at the city level. Now then, I just talked about emissions, which are millions of kilograms exhaust emissions from exhaust pipes. That is not quite the same as the ambient concentrations we are also trying to look at. There we talk about concentrations, so particulates per cubic meter. And this is not quite the same as the emission levels, although there is a strong correlation. The European Environmental Agency yearly gives a report on the quality of the status of air quality in Europe. And this is a figure, a map from that study showing in which places concentrations of, in this case, NOx are still quite high, where the red dots even show where the current norms are exceeded, the European standards are exceeded. And if you have a closer look, if you would have a closer look at this diagram, you would see that particularly in urban areas, the concentrations and the dots would be most present. So there is surely a relation between urban areas or urban density and the chances that concentrations or air quality is quite poor. Okay, this is a diagram, a schematic overview of what the actual concentrations of either PM or NOx will be within a city. This is not just caused by traffic, of course, if you're in a city. First of all, you have a level of international and natural background, which contributes to the overall concentrations found in a city. So these are emissions from all sectors combined abroad. And the wind brings in these emissions and they contribute to the concentration at a local site. After that, we have the national background. These are the emissions from all sectors combined in a specific country, and they also contribute to the local ambient concentration. After that, if we look specifically at an urban area, you have an urban background. So these are all the emissions from housing, but also from traffic, which also contribute to the overall concentration. And then specifically focusing on streets, there could be an additional element and contribution of, and that is mostly traffic, which increases the ambient concentrations even further. And these are sort of local spikes, particularly in, of course, in very busy streets. And it is very important to note that the share of these different elements, so international background, national background, urban background, can vary quite substantially between different cities. For example, if you have a city which is close to a seaport, the international and national background will be quite much larger than in a situation where you have a city which is more located in a mountainous area, for example. So this is a schematic overview, and what exactly determines the level of concentrations can vary greatly. So it's also important if we look at measures to closely look at what will be the impact of these measures and to take into account that they may not be as effective everywhere, which is always important, of course. So resuming on the state of play, total NOx and PM emissions have decreased in the last 20 years for all sectors, and they are expected to decrease further into the future. The same holds is for NOx and PM emissions from transport. And we have seen that passenger cars and heavy-duty vehicles are dominant, particularly for NOx emissions, and this is caused mainly by diesel vehicles. Then we have also seen that for PM emissions, tire and brake wear emissions have become dominant over the past 20 years in PM, which are still health related, important for health issues caused by these emissions. If we look at social costs, they are expected to drop, also because of the policies in place, but they will still amount to 50 to 20 billion euros in 2030, which is considerable, I think. We have seen that air quality or concentrations are poorest in densely populated areas, and the emissions from transport in cities only partly contribute to the ambient concentrations of NO2 and PM in the air. So we should definitely focus, if we look at local measures, not only focus on local measures to reduce air pollution or improve air quality, but to have the highest effectiveness of measures, they should be complemented by other measures as well for other sectors, but also at other locations, not just cities. And that is, I think, also important to realize. That is the first part of my presentation. I will then go to the policy intervention section. This is probably not readable because it's too small, but I just wanted to put your attention on it. This is a long list of measures we found doing the literature review, extensive literature review we did for the report. It includes now 28 measures, and it gives a rough overview of which options are available for city governments to take, which have been implemented in several cities across the world. And we have also done a qualitative assessment of these measures in terms of effectiveness, costs, and where they have been implemented. There's will be an appendix in the report also showing which cities in which countries have adopted these measures. So this is something I hope can inspire local and city governments to look at and see which options might be viable for their particular situation. But we will now focus on 5 selected measures which we looked at into more detail in the report. And these measures are, first of all, congestion charging. Second, environmental or low emission zones. Thirdly, car sharing schemes. Fourthly, parking policies. And then finally, cycling and walking policies, or also active modes, called active modes. And this selection was based on first of all, looking at the effectiveness of measures, which measures are quite effective, but not solely effectiveness. We also looked at other past experiences from implementation of these measures in various countries and various cities. And also we looked at different modes. So we didn't just want to focus on passenger car measures, but also look at other modes and options to reduce emissions, or options to implement at the city. So these 3 elements have finally led to the selection of these 5 measures, which of course are not necessarily the best measures to take, but they do give a nice overview, I think, of options that are available. It would of course be interesting to have maybe a broader set of emissions looked at in more detail, but I think this is at a first glance interesting enough to see what the differences in these measures are and what the effectiveness can be. So I will go into some more detail about these 5 measures in the next slides. So first of all, congestion charging has been adopted in London, Stockholm, Singapore, Göteborg, and Milan, among other cities. But these are the cities we found most information for in our study. It is actually a pricing policy or pricing tool. It entails including or introducing a tax or a toll, aiming to influence the demand of traffic in a certain time period or a certain area of the city, or a combination, both area and time is also possible. However, this is not required to have a time-specific and area-specific pricing policy. We have also found in our review that sort of a simple charge zone can already generate quite significant effects, which is also less complex to implement, because a time-dependent congestion charge can be quite difficult, and also difficult to communicate to the public, more difficult to communicate to the public in that sense. What is a benefit, of course, on the one hand of congestion charge, it generates revenues. That is important because at first it's quite an expensive measure to implement, but you have a sort of a return on investment because of the fees that are paid by the people who still enter the zone. And we have also found that it is quite important to invest these revenues from the congestion charging in other modes, public transport, slow modes, walking and cycling, for example, to ensure that there is a substitution available for those people who are no longer able or desiring to enter the city zone with a car. This is an important element when considering to implement this measure. If we look at the effectiveness of this measure, it's one of the most effective measures we looked at. For NOx, it might reduce 8 to 10% of emissions, and for PM, the reduction is up to 7 to 17% of emissions for the road transport sector, which is quite substantial. If we translate that to the a reduction in the social costs present in cities. We made a division between city size. So if we look at very large cities with more than 1 million inhabitants, a reduction in this magnitude of NOx and PM would amount to a reduction of social costs in the range of 31 to 96 million euros. And in smaller cities with less than 200 inhabitants, it would still be a saving of health costs or social costs, I should say, of 1 to 3 million euros, which is, I think, quite substantial. The next policy option is the low emission or environmental zone. Has also been adopted in many cities in many countries, particularly in Germany, also the Netherlands, Milan, London, Malmö, Stockholm and Brussels. That's where we found most of the information in our literature review. A low emission zone is similar to a congestion charging, a designated area within a city where the access is restricted for particular vehicles with a certain emission standard usually, which of course can be set by the local authority. There are some clear success factors. It is important to draw a well and a clear drawn territory, of course. Also, legal enforcement has been shown to be quite important for success. There should also be very strict exemption rules, not too many exemptions for specific companies or people allowing to enter the city. That would also reduce the effectiveness of the measure. And of course, clear communication to the public has also been shown to be very important to do, particularly even in advance before implementing such a measure. It's important to inform the public of what will be the consequences and what options there will be to even probably avoid the emission zones if needed. So if we look at effectiveness of the low emission zone, the effectiveness depends very highly in this case on the way it is implemented. So a very small zone with less strict rules for emission standards will lead to low emission reductions of about 2%, but very strict implementation can lead up to 36% reduction in NOx emissions. And for PM, the range is between 2 and 23%. A large range, but potentially thus very effective. Now, and if we translate this to an estimated reduction in social costs in 2020, this would amount to a maximum of 131 million euros for very large cities above 1 million population, and roughly 0 to 4 million euro for cities with inhabitants of less than 200,000. The third option or the third policy measure is car sharing schemes. They have also been implemented in quite a lot of cities. We looked specifically at Paris, Amsterdam, Cologne, and several other major cities in Europe and US where they have been implemented. This can be either a platform between users or owners of cars, private owners of cars, which you call consumer-to-consumer networks, or large-scale businesses where companies offer cars to consumers, which can be sort of rented, let's say, which is called business-to-consumer, B2C. We have seen that most of the initiatives which have been implemented in cities so far have been semi-commercial initiatives. Usually there is some public funding associated or combined with private equity or private money. We should also know that we have seen in several cities that have been profitability issues, that it is difficult for these companies to have a full return on investment and make a profitable business case for car sharing schemes. So that's an important thing to note. Car sharing schemes are likely to be most effective and most viable in areas where which are densely populated. So probably most applicable in very large cities to cover this profitability issue. It is also important to note that there might be some competition with public transport and slow and active mode, depending on the way the car sharing schemes is designed. But it might be possible that people who are currently using bikes or walking or using public transport decide to use a car scheme or to rent a car through a car sharing scheme. which is not necessarily a positive for air quality, particularly if it's a C2C, a consumer-to-consumer network, which actually uses older cars and maybe even diesel cars. So that is something to look closely at once considering implementing car sharing schemes, that it does not lead to actually an increase in emissions. So if we look at effectiveness, we also included that possible downside in the range of effectiveness, and we estimate that the reduction in emissions could be somewhere between a 5% reduction or a 5% increase, depending on the design. And if we translate that to a reduction in social costs, that would amount to approximately 22 to 28 million euros of savings for a maximum in a city of 1 million inhabitants or above, and somewhere approximately 1 million euros for smaller cities for car sharing schemes. Well, then we have parking policies. Obviously, widely used worldwide in urban areas, as you all will know. It's a pricing option at the one hand, but it can also be a supply option. Decreasing the amount of available parking spaces is also an option that local governments or city governments can take to reduce the amount of car traffic in a city. It is relatively easy to implement, particularly the pricing option. And the benefit of it is, of course, that it generates a steady income with which all expenses of a city can be paid for, which is also the common practice in most cities which adopt it. A restriction in supply could be done, of course, but this will hinder the access of a city to a city with cars. It's always a good idea, we found in literature, to combine this with measures that allow people to enter the city through other modes, for example, with a park and ride system or with a proper public transport to sort of allow for substitution between car and other modes to still enter the city and not decrease accessibility of cities. If you look at the effectiveness, this measure is fairly effective to reduce emissions, estimated at a reduction of 5 to 10% for both NOx and PM. And this relates to a reduction in social costs to be estimated at a range of 22 to 56 million euros for large cities above 1 million inhabitants, and 1 to 2 for smaller cities with less than 200,000 inhabitants. Then the final policy option we looked at is cycling and walking, or promoting active modes. That has actually become more and more popular over the last 10 to 5 years. We looked specifically at cities Copenhagen, Rotterdam, Antwerp, Strasbourg, Paris, Berlin, and London, which are quite advanced in terms of looking at biking infrastructure. It actually entails a mix of different modes or different options to implement. It can be, on the one hand, about infrastructure for biking or walking, but it can also be complemented by bike sharing schemes or lower zero car zones in which only biking or walking, for example, is allowed, and the car is not allowed in these areas. What we found from our evaluation is also that separate bike lanes are preferable. Biking is, of course, an active mode, and in that sense is also contributes to health, has health benefits. But on the other hand, it's less safe than driving a car or driving public transport. So it might induce additional traffic injuries or even fatalities. But this can be compensated or prevented to a large extent if separate bike lanes are adopted or implemented. However, this can be more challenging, of course, specifically in dense urban areas where space is just more scarce than in other areas. So this is something that should be looked at very carefully. Cycling and walking is at this point popular, as I said, but it's often initiated from the climate perspective, so reducing CO2 emissions, not particularly air quality, but it still also has benefits for air quality, of course, because it is zero emission mobility, and combining the efforts from climate and air quality should be considered by local governments who want to do something about air quality, in our opinion. The city layout, we also found, has become much less of a problem with the introduction of electric bikes, even in cities of San Francisco, where there are very, very steep inclines, which with a conventional bike are not easy to take. that is quite easy to overcome with electric bikes. So there's not really a city layout limitation anymore for the introduction of quite substantial cycling and walking infrastructure possibilities. In terms of effectiveness, it is not the most effective measure of the 5 that we looked at. We estimate the reduction of in the range of 0 to 5% in emissions. And that entails a estimated reduction of social costs between 0 and 28 million euros for very large cities, and 0 to 1 million euros for cities below 200,000 inhabitants. So that is the measures in some more detail. I will now resume on what we have found for these 5 measures. In this diagram is also included in the report, of course. We see that congestion charging and low emission zones or environmental zones have quite the potential of reducing emissions to quite a large extent, in the range between 10 and 20%. We can also see here that the bandwidth is quite substantial for environmental zones, and can be even much higher than the 20% I just mentioned, depending on the strictness on the area, as I just mentioned before. We also see that parking policies are quite effective, and what is also an additional benefit is that the implementation costs of these are quite low. So this is something definitely to consider if the desire is to reduce emissions from transport. Car sharing schemes, cycling and walking policies are not that effective. For cycling and walking policies, it should also be noted that the cost might be fairly high, specifically if we look at infrastructure in cities. On the other hand, we should also know that cycling infrastructure is quite a lot cheaper than implementing a car infrastructure, which takes a lot of more space. So in that sense, it might be more beneficial to expand on cycling infrastructure compared to car infrastructure in cities, if that is needed. On the social costs, also a short resume. If we look at congestion charging and low emission zones, this can lead to a drop or a reduction in total social costs and health costs of 30 to 95 million euros, which is an equivalent of a drop in 1 to 3% of the total social costs in these cities. For small cities, these 2 measures can reduce the social costs in the range of 1 to 3 million euros. The other 3 measures can reduce social costs in the range of 0 to 60 million in metropoles and 0 to 2 million euros in smaller cities. These are, I think, quite substantial figures looking at implementing measures and the benefits that they can take up. There's a diagram or a table included in this sheet, which is only for illustrative purposes. We have quite a lot of these tables in the final report, and I would certainly recommend you to look at that once it's available, which has more detailed figures on each of the measures and on specific types of cities and sizes of cities. So that is something to look at once the report is available. So then I will come at the final sheet and the main conclusions of our report. We have seen that local and urban measures are able to substantially reduce NOx and PM emissions. However, it depends highly on the local situation and design, as we saw that the share of transport in the local concentration can vary highly between different cities, and of course, not at each city is the same. So we should carefully look at implementing measures which are effective for a specific situation, and also tailor-made approaches are necessary. The impact on emissions and social cost reductions are highest for the congestion charge and the low emission and environmental zones, as we just have seen. But good to note that uncertainties are quite large, particularly for the low emission zones, so that again, tailor-made approaches are necessary. The effects we presented in this study, they give a broad idea of what the impact could be, but once a city government obviously is considering implementing a measure, it is very important to look at the local situation and see what the impacts there could be, what the public acceptance could be, and what indeed the effectiveness of a measure could be in that specific area. Some general governance issues we also came across. It is very important, we saw for many measures that we looked at, and particularly the 5 we focused on, to have a public awareness campaigns, probably even in advance, before considering implementing quite strict measures to improve air quality. This has proven to be quite successful, for example, in Baden-Württemberg, where we had an interview with a delegate from that area. Public awareness can help greatly in the acceptance of measures implemented by city governments. Second, a clear long-term strategy is also very important, which should be communicated, of course, but also an additional benefit could be that there is a very vocal or present policymaker or governor which sort of promotes this long-term strategy, and also is very clear about what the goals are and how they will be achieved. This is sort of part of the public awareness campaign, but it also has to deal with communication of this long-term strategy. And this we found was important for the effectiveness and success of measures to implement. A third issue that we came across is that it's not always easy to implement measures which are targeted to reduce the level or amount of cars entering a city. That is something that we found in the interviews as well, that many professionals or civil servants that actually try to design the measures are maybe somewhat car-minded still, and are not looking specifically or very innovatively at measures that try to reduce car travel or car use in cities. And that is something to take into account when trying to implement or trying to design measures. The potential savings, finally, then, in social costs, we think are still quite substantial when we implement these measures. Now, we have looked, of course, at the impact of several measures. We didn't look at combining these measures, but if you combine measures, of course, the overall impacts on reduction of social costs may be even higher. And we think that these insights might encourage local or city governments to consider and maybe even implement these measures, because they have an additional argument to say what the benefits will be of implementing measures, not only a drop in emissions and an improvement in air quality, but also an element that can show what the health benefits may be of implementing these measures. So that concludes my presentation.